John Wayne Gacy, March 17, 1942, May 10, 1994, was an American serial killer and sex offender known as the Killer Clown, who assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy regularly performed as Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown, characters he had created at children's hospitals and charity events. According to Gacy, he committed all his murders at his ranch-style house near Norwood Park, a neighborhood in the Chicago metropolitan area, Illinois. Typically, he lured his victims to his home and then deceived them into putting on handcuffs under the pretense of showing them a magic trick. He would then sexually assault and torture the bound individuals before killing them by asphyxiation or strangulation with a garrote. 26 victims were buried in the crawl space of his house, while 3 others were buried elsewhere on his property. The remains of 4 victims were discarded in the Des Plaines River. In 1968, Gacy was convicted for the sodomy of a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa, and sentenced to 10 years in prison, though he served only 18 months. He killed his first victim in 1972, followed by 2 more by the end of 1975. At least 30 additional victims were murdered after his divorce from his second wife in 1976. The investigation into the disappearance of Robert Pierce, a teenager from Des Plaines, led to Gacy's arrest on December 21, 1978. His conviction for 33 murders, committed by one individual, was the highest number of murders for which anyone had been convicted in U.S. legal history at that time. Gacy was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980. While awaiting execution at Menard Correctional Center, he spent much of his time painting. He was ultimately executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. Early life. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois, on March 17, 1942, as the second child and only son of John Stanley Gacy. His father was a mechanic and a World War I veteran, while his mother was a homemaker. Gacy had Polish and Danish ancestry, and his family was Catholic. His paternal grandparents, who spelled their last name as Gotza or Gacka, immigrated to the United States from Poland, which was then part of German Prussia. Childhood. Gacy was close to his mother and 2 sisters, but had a troubled relationship with his father, who was an alcoholic and physically abused his family. His father belittled him, often calling him dumb and stupid, and made inappropriate comparisons to his sisters. One of Gacy's earliest memories was being whipped with a leather belt by his father for accidentally disassembling parts of a car engine that his father had assembled. Although his mother tried to protect him, her support led to accusations that Gacy was a sissy and a spoiled child who would probably be gay. Despite the mistreatment, Gacy still loved his father, but felt he was never good enough in his father's eyes. In 1949, Gacy's father was informed that his son and another boy had been caught fondling a young girl. As punishment, he whipped Gacy with a belt. That same year, a family friend and contractor occasionally molested Gacy in his truck, but Gacy never told his father about it for fear of blame. Gacy was overweight and not athletic as a child. Due to a heart condition, he was advised to avoid all sports in school. In the 4th grade, he began experiencing fainting spells and was hospitalized several times for this condition, as well as for a burst appendix in 1957. Gacy later estimated that he spent nearly a year in the hospital between the ages of 14 and 18, attributing his declining grades to his absences from school. His father suspected these behaviors were attempts to gain sympathy and openly accused him of faking his condition while lying in his hospital bed. Although his mother, sisters, and a few close friends never doubted his illness, Gacy's medical condition was never definitively diagnosed. A high school friend recalled several instances where Gacy's father ridiculed or beat him without cause. In one case in 1957, he witnessed Gacy's father coming out of the basement drunk, humiliating him, and then beating him without any reason. Execution on the morning of May 9, 1994. Gacy was transferred from the Menard Correctional Center to the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed to have a private picnic with his family in the prison yard. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. That night, before being escorted to the execution chamber for a lethal injection, he prayed with a Catholic priest. Before the execution began, the chemicals used for the execution unexpectedly solidified, blocking the 4 line used to administer the chemicals in Gacy's arm, complicating the process. The curtains for the witnesses were drawn down as the execution team replaced the clogged line. After 10 minutes, the curtains were reopened, and the execution resumed. The entire process took 18 minutes. Anesthesia experts attributed the problem to the inexperience of the prison officials in carrying out the execution, stating that if the proper procedures had been followed, these complications would not have occurred. This error apparently led to Illinois adopting an alternative method for lethal injection. Regarding this issue, one of Gacy's prosecutors, William Kunkel, remarked, "He will die much easier than any of his victims." According to published reports, Gacy was a diagnosed psychopath who expressed no remorse for his crimes. His last words to his attorney before his execution were that killing him would not compensate for the harm done to others and that the government was killing him. His final statement was, "Kiss my ass." In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, a crowd of over 1,000 people gathered outside the correctional facility. The majority openly supported the execution, although a number of anti-death penalty protesters were also present. Some death penalty supporters wore T-shirts referencing Gacy's previous community service as a clown, with humorous slogans like "Tears for the Clown." Anti-death penalty protesters lit candles in remembrance. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, his brain was removed from his body. This brain was given to Helen Morrison, a defense witness in Gacy's trial, who had interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an effort to identify common personality traits among violent sociopaths. Ultimately, his body was cremated. Gacy later confessed that he encountered Butkovich while getting out of his car at the corner of West Lawrence Avenue and waved to get his attention. According to Gacy, Butkovich approached his car and said, "I want to talk to you." Gacy invited Butkovich into his car and then invited him to his home to supposedly resolve his overdue wage issue. In addition to the year his business expanded, Gacy admitted that 1975 was also the year he began increasing the frequency of his trips to have sex with young men. He often referred to these trips as cruising. Gacy committed most of his murders between 1976 and 1978, as he was living mostly alone after his divorce. He later referred to these years as his years of cruising. Although Gacy was social and civic-minded, several neighbors noticed irregular changes in his behavior after his divorce in 1976. This included seeing him with young men, hearing his car come and go in the early morning hours, or noticing the lights in his house turning on and off at odd hours. One neighbor later recalled that for several years, the sounds of screaming, shouting, and muffled cries frequently woke her and her son in the early morning. She identified that the noises were coming from a house adjacent to theirs on West Samardale Street. 1,976 a month after his divorce was finalized, Gacy kidnapped and murdered 18-year-old Daryl Sampson. He was last seen alive on April 6, 1976, in Chicago. Gacy buried him under the dining room, placing a piece of cloth in his throat. 5 weeks later, on the afternoon of May 14, 15-year-old Randall Goff went missing while walking home from St. Sabina High School. Hours after Goff was abducted by Gacy, 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton disappeared while walking home from his sister's apartment. They were buried together in Gacy's home, and investigators believe both victims were killed on the same night. On June 3, Gacy killed a 17-year-old named Michael Bonin, who disappeared while traveling from Chicago to Waukegan. Gacy strangled Bonin and buried him under the bedroom. 10 days later, Gacy killed a young man named William Carroll. On August 5. A 16-year-old from Minnesota named James Hawkinson was last heard from by his family, likely from Gacy's home. Hawkinson died from asphyxiation. Gacy is believed to have murdered two other unidentified men between August and October 1976. On October 24, Gacy kidnapped and killed teenage friends Kent Parker and Michael Marino, who were last seen outside a restaurant on Clark Street in Chicago. 2 days later, a 19-year-old construction worker named William Bundy went missing after informing his family that he was going to a party. Bundy also died from asphyxiation, and Gacy buried his body under his master bedroom. He had apparently worked for Gacy. Arrest after learning that police had found human remains in his home and that he would now face murder charges, Gacy told officers that he wanted to clear the air, adding that he had known since the previous evening that his arrest was inevitable. He had spent the night on the couch in his attorney's office. In the early hours of December 22, in the presence of his lawyers, Gacy made a formal statement in which he confessed to the murder of nearly 30 young men, all of whom had willingly entered his home. Some victims were named, but Gacy claimed he did not know or remember most of their names. He stated that all of them were runaway teenagers or male prostitutes, most of whom he had buried in his home. Gacy claimed he had only dug 5 graves for victims at that location and had asked his employees, including Gregory Godzik, to dig the remaining trenches to have a grave available. One victim was from the lake. Another was a native of Michigan. When shown the driver's license issued to Robert Haston, which was found on his property, Gacy claimed he did not recognize him, but admitted that the license had belonged to one of his victims. In January 1979, he intended to further conceal the bodies by covering the entire area with concrete. When specifically asked about Pius, Gacy confessed that he had taken him to his home on the evening of December 11 and had strangled him. He also admitted that he had slept next to Pius' body that night before disposing of the body in the Des Plaines River in the early hours of December 13. On the way to the police station, he had been involved in a minor car accident. His vehicle had gone off the icy road and needed to be towed from the scene. Accompanied by police, his lawyers, and his older sister, Gacy was driven to the I-55 bridge on December 23 to pinpoint the exact location where he confessed to having thrown the body of Robert Pius and 4 other victims into the Des Plaines River. He was then taken back to his home and instructed to mark the floor of his garage with orange spray paint to indicate where he had buried a person he claimed to have killed in self-defense, whom he referred to as John Butkovich. Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, on charges of 33 murders. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois, before Judge Louis Garibo. The jury was selected from Rockford due to significant media coverage in Cook County. At the request of his defense attorney, Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester in the year leading up to the trial. He underwent various psychological tests before a panel of psychiatrists to determine whether he was mentally fit for trial. Gacy attempted to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have four personalities: a hard-working and civic-minded contractor, a clown, an active politician, and a police officer named Jack Hanley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack. When Gacy confessed to the police, he claimed that Jack was the one who committed the crimes, expressing hatred for homosexuality and viewing male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and low. His lawyers decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Presenting Gacy as a Jekyll and Hyde character, the defense called several psychiatric experts who had evaluated Gacy. 3 psychiatric experts testified at Gacy's trial, diagnosing him with paranoid schizophrenia and multiple personalities. Prosecutors presented the case that Gacy was sane and had complete control over his actions. To support this claim, they brought several witnesses to testify about Gacy's deliberate actions and his attempts to evade detection. Those doctors rejected the defense's claims of multiple personalities and insanity. Cram and Rossi testified that Gacy had forced them to dig drainage trenches and spread lime bags around his home. Both stated that Gacy periodically checked on them to ensure that they and other supervised employees did not stray from the precise locations he had marked. Sentenced to death after his conviction, Gacy was transferred to the Menard Correctional Center, where he remained on death row for 14 years. On February 15, 1983, Henry Brisbois, a death row inmate known as the I-57 Killer, attacked Gacy with a sharp wire while Gacy was participating in a volunteer work program, stabbing him in the upper arm. William Jones, a second death row inmate injured in the attack, suffered a superficial knife wound to his head. Both were treated for their injuries at the prison hospital. Appeal after his incarceration, Gacy read numerous legal books and filed extensive appeals, although he was unsuccessful in any of them. His appeals related to issues such as the validity of the initial search warrant issued to the police on December 13, 1978, and his objection to his lawyer's defense of insanity during his trial. Gacy also claimed that while he had some information about 5 murders, the murders of McCoy, Butkovich, Godzik, Schick, and Pius, the other 28 murders were committed by employees who had access to the keys to his house while he was away on business trips. In mid-1984, the Illinois Supreme Court upheld Gacy's conviction and his death sentence by lethal injection, ordering it to be carried out on November 14. His defense attorney, Richard Kling, argued that Gacy had received ineffective legal counsel during his 1980 trial. Execution on the morning of May 9, 1994. Gacy was transferred from the Menard Correctional Center to the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed to have a private picnic with his family in the prison yard. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. That night, before being escorted to the execution chamber for a lethal injection, he prayed with a Catholic priest. Before the execution began, the chemicals used for the execution unexpectedly solidified, blocking the 4-line used to administer the chemicals in Gacy's arm, complicating the process. The curtains for the witnesses were drawn down as the execution team replaced the clogged line. After 10 minutes, the curtains were reopened, and the execution resumed. The entire process took 18 minutes. Anesthesia experts attributed the problem to the inexperience of the prison officials in carrying out the execution, stating that if the proper procedures had been followed, these complications would not have occurred. This error apparently led to Illinois adopting an alternative method for lethal injection. Regarding this issue, one of Gacy's prosecutors, William Kunkel, remarked, "He will die much easier than any of his victims." According to published reports, Gacy was a diagnosed psychopath who expressed no remorse for his crimes. His last words to his attorney before his execution were that killing him would not compensate for the harm done to others and that the government was killing him. His final statement was, "Kiss my ass." In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, a crowd of over 1,000 people gathered outside the correctional facility. The majority openly supported the execution, although a number of anti-death penalty protesters were also present. Some death penalty supporters wore T-shirts referencing Gacy's previous community service as a clown, with humorous slogans like "Tears for the Clown." Anti-death penalty protesters lit candles in remembrance. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, his brain was removed from his body. This brain was given to Helen Morrison, a defense witness in Gacy's trial, who had interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an effort to identify common personality traits among violent sociopaths. Ultimately, his body was cremated.